who is also a professor of history at Roosevelt University, where she also directs the Center of New Deal Studies and the History Program. And Margaret is a specialist on the 20th century political history with a focus on the Roosevelt era. And I'm sorry if you hear sirens in the background, but I'm right off Lakeshore Drive, so it's a pretty busy area. She focuses on the Roosevelt era and has also published on topics ranging from the New Deal, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And Margaret is also a Fulbright Scholar Award recipient, and you're also scheduled to teach in the National Taiwan in spring of 2020. I hope that still comes to fruition for you, Margaret. And Margaret holds a MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University. So without further ado, I'm very happy to announce our author here today, David Michaelis. David is a prize-winning best-selling author, and your book is described as a portrait of Eleanor Roosevelt, America's longest-serving First Lady, and she's an avatar of democracy whose ever-expanding agency as a diplomat, activist, and humanitarian made her one of the world's most widely and admired and influential women. And you wrote a book about her. So welcome, David. Welcome, Margaret. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you for inviting me and helping to organize what is, I think, going to be a really lively discussion. I'm going to jump right in and also mention that toward the end, we'll have some time for Q&A, and you can put your questions in the chat function, and then I will call on people, and Kathy's requested that you unmute yourself when I call on you so that you can ask the question rather than have me read it. So that will be in about half an hour or so. So I wanted to start, David, with a question about this portrait of Eleanor, which is an extremely intimate, I think, and very personal biography of her. And of course, you had this connection to her, having met her when you were 4 to get your piece of juicy fruit. And your mother worked for her. So I'm wondering if you could just start by telling me a little bit about your preconceptions of Eleanor going into the project. And then the way that those conceptions either changed or did not as you finished the book.
Big question, and thank you. It's a really good one because it kind of, it's sort of like doing the whole thing in charades. It does sum up the whole thing. And basically, both what I felt about her from childhood and from, university education in the mid to late 70s, and just life going forward. I had reviewed Blanche Wiesen-Cook's book once for a newspaper in my days as a New York City journalist. But my sense of Eleanor was that she was homework. That it was eat your vegetables time. It was time to get serious. This was going to be always a very challenging and very serious thing to do. Whatever it was that involved Eleanor was going to be very challenging and serious. And I felt that when I first looked into the archives at Hyde Park, I both felt incredibly relieved that I no longer had to practice anything like access journalism in order to be here. In other words, to be there, you can be there, I can be there. You are scholars most welcome, but the United States, the American people own the right to go in and study Eleanor Roosevelt. And that's where I wanted to be at the start of my book. And I wanted the reader to have a book about Eleanor that was going to be about Eleanor and not about homework and not about vegetables. And that they would be able to find access to the serious homework and the serious vegetables by knowing her, like really seeing somehow into her life through her own eyes. Perhaps that's a bit, fictional in a way. I don't really try to do that, but I do try to use her point of view very closely to stay with her part of the story, which is such an enormous, incredibly large story. And the record of her life, which is also what I was hoping the book would liberate her from, is a record that yourself, Margaret, it's 1 million documents, even just going into the FDR library. It's archives around the country. It's university libraries and places, repositories everywhere that have letters from Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of letters. And so my sense was, I both have to somehow master and grasp the archival world, the record of Eleanor, as a scholar does, as you must do, because you of course see new. You see anew the minute you get inside the material, but I really wanted to free her life from the record itself. And I really admired Blanche Wiesen-Cook's 3-volume biography, but a 3-volume biography is a 3-volume biography. It tends to absorb you into it in a way that is virtually endless. I do admire the long studies, the Caros on LBJ. But I have to confess, it's harder for me to grasp that life when it's spread out that way. So this really was going to be a kind of Philip Petit, stretch the line between the 2 trade towers and walk that line and make sure it all happened all in one go, ultimately for a reader. And because Eleanor is so immense, and I felt the scale of her as a child, I felt the scale of her as a younger person. And I know that if I had, for instance, ever been insane enough to think that this would have been a first subject, when I was younger, I would have absolutely fallen off the high wire. It was a job for somebody much later in life who knew that it was going to take this long period of time and to be comfortable with the great. I don't know. I think everybody today has a sense that we all should have conviction about things without doubt. And it's the conviction and doubt in Eleanor herself and in a biographer of an Eleanor that I wanted to see whole. It's not just the one or the other. It's really both. It's always both together. And that's really the story of Eleanor too.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it does kind of lead into my next question, which is, could you talk a little bit about what particular parts of the biography were especially challenging to write and why? When you're entering into the life of somebody who was such a public figure and was so well documented, as you said, lots of people know the vegetables, they know the sort of highlights of her life and her causes. But you had to immerse yourself so totally in her, and then you had to figure out what you were going to present in 1 volume. So I'm just wondering if there are any particular parts of the biography where you were really struggling or challenged by something that you found, or some aspect of her life that you felt you had to include but didn't have room.
Yeah, there's the biggest one for that was my weird idea when I signed a contract to write Untitled biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. I kind of told myself almost like a secret thing especially when they were insisting that I get it done in 4 years, which I know sounds like a really long time, but in fact was really no time at all. And I told them it's going to be twice that. I guarantee you I will be late for 4 years. So just prepare for me to be late. But I thought to myself secretly, you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to really have to study Franklin Roosevelt. I kind of know who, and that was the joke, was that I really believed that. I was in a total delusion that I was going to be able to write this book without immersing myself in the Franklin Roosevelt presidential identity and the identity of the man. Well, guess what? He's her spouse. Of course I had to. By that very same token, I was really flummoxed by how do you do the polio part of it, which, from Sunrise at Campobello, the Dari Shari both play and, dreadful movie, through wonderful studies by Jeffrey Ward and people from Warm Springs. In other words, there was the depth of FDR's scholarship and historiography was so extreme that yes, I had to study, but how would I incorporate the scenes and themes and also just sheer exposition of his life as it was impacting on Eleanor and not go overboard and not lose track of that this is a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. So that was always the huge balancing act. Then there was the feeling I felt of, we think we know what she was doing, but we really don't. So I would get really lost in the rabbit holes of newspapers from the time and get down into the real underbrush. For instance, I really tried to understand what it meant for her When she arrived in Washington in 1913, she was not a suffragette or a suffragist. She did not even believe fully that women were, that across the board, women were educated enough or could be smart enough to make the choices they needed to make to understand politics, which was a sort of dirty thing for at the polling. Even polling places were kind of seen as shady. It was a bit of corruption everywhere. She didn't think that women in 1913, she did not think women would make the most intelligent voters as they should be. She was very pragmatic always in her decisions about things, even about the ERA, for instance, where she pragmatically realized that the gains made for women, working women, would be lost if the ERA, as it was then structured, were suddenly passed. Anyhow, I tried to really understand what it meant for her as a Roosevelt, as the niece of the former President Roosevelt, now wife of the Secretary of the Navy, the fifth highest or fifth ranking undersecretary official in Washington, what Wilson's newly segregated Washington meant to her, all the things that I thought it always were sort of done as a kind of a demure PBS Edwardian teacups era, actually had so much more grit in it, and her own responses were so different. So that was always the challenge. It was coming onto a new period in the story, and not letting myself just sort of coast on preconceptions, and really opening it up to a new look at it. And often that was race, and often that was and that period especially was all about race in a way that I never had known before.
Yeah, and I actually thought that section of the book was particularly illuminating, because I feel that in many ways that's sort of that period is kind of the lost period in her life. So people tend to know a lot about her childhood and the fact that she was an orphan and that she went to Allenswood and sort of transformed herself. And then we skip ahead to the 20s when she becomes this very public figure. And I've often felt, and I think Blanche Wiesen-Cook's book does obviously cover that period pretty well, but I've often felt that there was clearly something happening to her in the teens and during the war, the First World War, that set her up for the 1920s. In other words, she didn't leap from, married woman at home to public life in the 20s. There was something there. And so I felt that part of your book really illuminated her in ways that hadn't been demonstrated previously. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I would like to talk a little bit about her evolution as a person, as a politician, as a civic leader. And I wanted to do that in two ways. One, I wanted to actually just ask you a couple questions about your front cover of Eleanor, which is a beautiful portrait. And then I hope everybody noticed, but on the inside front cover, we have a picture of her as a young child with her finger up near her mouth. And then in the back, you chose a very similar portrait of her, or somebody at the publishing house did, in later life. So I'm wondering if you could just talk for a couple of minutes about the visual image of her, because in your book, you spend a lot of time talking about her appearance in different periods of her life, and you will describe her physical appearance and the way she walked and the way she looked and how other people responded to her physical appearance. So I'm just curious about that aspect of the book and these images that you chose.
Well, going to the end papers, especially the characteristic, sort of finger of admonishment. And by the way, the final one, there's another one I liked a lot more, although my wonderful editor at Simon Schuster did persuade me that image would reproduce best and be best. So I was glad about that. But it goes from a period of her life at the age of 4 and 5, when she actually was in the happiest part of the tiniest little sliver of childhood that she actually enjoyed, which was when her father was still Elliot Roosevelt, brother of Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States, but at that time, commissioner in Washington. But Elliot was a sportsman and man about town, and he and his new bride, Anna Hall, who was from an old New York family, both of them from old New York families, were really scaling the social heights of this new New York of Vanderbilt and Astor and Morgan, and feeling a little marginalized because their old families were slightly slipping down, whereas this huge wealth was growing up around them. So they were a bit in states of, sort of distraction and struggle, and they weren't yet figuring out how to live their lives. He was alcoholic. She was highly narcissistic in a certain kind of, in a limited way, and was very cruel to Eleanor. Eleanor had a connection with her father that she did not have with anybody else, and with anybody else forever, in a sense, that it was that her father and the relationship she had with him was a template for longing and wishing to be connected and wishing to belong for the rest of her life, partly because she lost her mother, then her younger brother, and then her father, all within 19 months, so that she was orphaned by the age of 10 in a quite horrible childhood. That, as I was going to say, there was this brief interlude when she was 4, 5, and 6, where she would go into her father's room in the morning, and he would be hungover, and it was not yet, had not yet begun any of the descent into alcoholism and drug addiction that finished him off and ended his life. But he would tease her, and it was a playful time, and she would, lift a finger and tell him, you've got to get out of bed. Mother's going to be very angry with you. And she sort of played this role that she played all her life, but was particularly trained to by her father, and then later as an orphan by her grandmother and feckless, irresponsible aunts and uncles. She became a child adult. She became kind of like Little Nell in Dickens, in the old curiosity shop. She with her grand, she would come in and be the mother. She would be the wife to her father, and she was, as when her parents and her older younger brother died, she became the mother to her youngest brother. And in a way, she was a granny, as her mother quite cruelly called her, by choice in her own life, because she had to granny herself. She had to parent herself. So this sort of parenting is a self-parenting, and it's really the characteristic of her life. That, I mean, Eleanor is Eleanor not for any reason. She's not Eleanor because of Franklin Roosevelt or because of her parents and their troubles. She's Eleanor because of Eleanor. She was always, actually, I think, always her own greatest teacher and her own greatest, everything about her comes from her. She's really nobody else's creature. And at the end, she would turn to Harry Truman, with a finger, or she'd turn to Khrushchev with a finger. And it was, I think, people at a certain point wanted to be scolded by an Eleanor Roosevelt. Some of those men did, because she knew better, and they were totally irresponsible about certain things. World peace for one, the Cold War for another. I mean, she was, if you consider her in that last part, there really is no one else in the world like her. She's beyond category. There's no female statesman in that particular part of the Cold War, and we can go on into the details of that. But that's really what that's about. Is one more time, she's her own. She's beyond category, and she's in her own place. The jacket image I didn't choose so much as the art director at Simon & Schuster found this 1915 portrait and came in on it so tightly that you feel, I think, a simulacrum, in a sense, of the book itself, which I hope brings you in to her and through her own eyes to see up close, that we're going to be up close this time. That's the point of this story, is we're going to get closer to, as close as we can, because by the way, she's one of the most unknowable people I've ever spent 10 years with, in the sense that it's really hard to know her. And for years, I used to think of being in this room as being like a guy in a nylon tent on a mountain where I couldn't move that day because the mist had come down over Everest and there was no moving at all. It was just stuck. And I was stuck a lot because I didn't want to keep going up the same routes that the Japanese expedition had gone up. And there were too many bottles, littered oxygen bottles on that route. I wanted to find my own route, but how? How do you do this? And this was the thing with Eleanor, is that it was really finally, there was a couple of mysteries that I ended up feeling I solved for myself in terms of how do you move up this mountain and find the route. And that was really that there was going to be no route, and that she herself in her own life didn't ever have a route, and everything was about figuring it out for herself. I mean, I know that sounds obvious, but when she had to deal, even for instance, as an orphan, with uh, abusive, predatory, alcoholic uncles who only a few years ago had been the most charming men in the world, tennis champion, first US tennis champions at Newport in the 1880s. I mean, when the game was called lawn tennis and was just getting started, these were charming, charming men. But now, 20 years later, predatory, abusive, alcoholic, being thrown in jail, and grandmother Hall wasn't going to go down and bail them out. Eleanor was. And so how do you do that? And then the locks on the door on her own bedroom to keep them out. And there was nobody telling her how. There was nobody with a book. There was no book to hand to her and say, this is what you do when your uncles are trying to get in your room at night. It was always, nothing was said. You couldn't be angry. You couldn't have feelings, all those old Edwardian things. So it was always watching how she responded and what she did, because she left a written record, and it's just an extraordinary, it is Everest of material, but it was always what she did. And I fell in love with her as a person of action. I love the words. It's very beguiling to read Eleanor. She's very plain spoken, incredibly observant, very, very, very noticing of things, details, which is always compelling to me, and dealing very much in specifics and not abstractions, which also is compelling. But it was always how she responded that told the story, and that's character, I guess. I mean, action is character and all that. But that was the beginning of understanding what I was doing.
Yeah, and I think that's I don't know if it was intentional, but I think for many people who study her, we see her life in black and white because that's how many of the photographs are presented to us. And so to have the color portrait on the exterior and then the interior, to have those black and white portraits, I thought was really interesting. And it sort of suggested too the way that you were able to kind of fill her out and to bring color to her in ways that I think hadn't been done previously. So I was really struck by that. I did want to ask, I know we're getting a little short on time and we want to give some time for Q&A, but I did want to ask a couple of questions about her politics, because you just talked so eloquently about Eleanor as an educator, as somebody who kind of rose above these partisan divides. And, she, as you said, you can't really put her in a category at the end of her life. I mean, she just exists as a towering figure of the 20th centuries. And I would even say in some ways had much more of an impact even than her husband did in certain respects, if you think about her relationship to the United Nations. But at the same time, what really struck me over and over again, and I've seen this in other sources and documents, she was very dedicated to the Democratic Party. And, she was a Democrat to the end with a capital D. I mean, she was also a Democrat with a small d, but the party meant a lot to her. And I sort of felt, I mean, when you think about her little teapot stunt in the 1920s, to her scolding of Truman in the 50s, and she's sort of yelling at him about not supporting the party strongly enough, and how, you have to put aside your own personal interests for the party. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the fact that Eleanor maybe is just as critical to building that Democratic Party coalition as was FDR.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons for her commitment to the Democratic Party is that at bottom, I think she saw democracy, lowercase d, she saw the part of democracy that was reciprocal, where it wasn't just about institutions balancing and checking and balancing. It was about how we treat each other as individuals, how communities treat each other, and how we treat, obviously, the least among us and all that. As she saw the Democratic Party as the party of good government, and good government was how government was going to improve human welfare, how it was going to bring social justice. I think that was the goal of her generation. And I think she recognized that the biggest obstacle to good government and progress in human development, in human welfare and social justice were the machines. And the Tammany Hall in New York City, meaning a single man, a sort of Trumpian-like person, a Boss Tweed, a Charlie Murphy, a very prejudicial, narcissistic, slightly monstrous man with too much power and the ability to take revenge on anybody at any time, was in charge of dishing out the goods and the things and the favors to the Democratic Party faithful in ward after ward after ward. And if you stepped off the, I mean, I'm being very simplistic here, but if you stepped off a boat at Ellis Island and you came ashore, you were not greeted by the US government saying, sign here, we're going to give you a social security card, and sign, you know, here, and we're going to bring you this. You were greeted by a guy who said, we're bringing you ice on a hot day up 4 flights in your tenement, and we're putting it in an ice box that we're building for you. And once we do that, you're going to owe us a favor. And by the way, on election day, we'll be sending someone over. So it was, that was the machine. The machine was running it. There was no Social Security. Franklin Roosevelt hadn't become president. Eleanor Roosevelt hadn't joined the New Deal. This is the thing that's so weird, is that Eleanor's first experience, to me weird, because Eleanor saw firsthand the results of no regulation, of disease everywhere in the streets, of her own family being diseased and falling, her mother falling ill with diphtheria, her younger brother with scarlet fever. I mean, she saw her aunts and uncles suffering from all kinds of things that later on were regulated, that Theodore Roosevelt, her uncle, tried to regulate, that became part of New Deal legislation. So in other words, her own life has the arc of what the Democratic Party became in the mid-century, which was the party of good government, and then of minority groups and of a larger and larger coalition, which she actively, as you say, was part of building. And the greatest contribution, I think, if you go to the second election that FDR won, the landslide of 1936, it was Eleanor's, one of my professors in college, Nancy Weiss-Malkiel, wrote a wonderful book about how the party of Lincoln became the party of FDR's coalition. And therein she describes how Eleanor had a role to play in allowing African Americans to trust that these Democrats, who up till then were Southern racists, basically in their eyes, were not people who were looking for to widen and open the doors of opportunity and equality. The New Deal was a pretty racialist set of programs, until people like Eleanor and Harry Hopkins, but Raymond Tugwell, brought young African Americans, particularly African American youth, into different programs. And we then see Eleanor bringing Mary McLeod Bethune, the great African American educator from Florida, into what became the Black Cabinet. And all these were steps that allowed the African American community, both immediately around Eleanor and Franklin and the New Deal in Washington, but also across the country, to trust and think we have a place. And it wasn't, these problems were not being solved overnight. There was continual sense that not enough was being done. And Eleanor, I think, recognized that as well and was pretty honest about it, as FDR could not be under the stranglehold of the worst part of his politics, which were using and needing the Southern Democrats as a coalition to get New Deal legislation passed. They held the Senate in a way that the Senate Republicans now hold a strangle lock on any progressive or even meaningful legislation. And so you see that. And I wanted to say that that's really a large part. I think I meant to say maybe 2 questions back, but one of the strongest things that happened to me while writing this book about my conceptions of Eleanor was that I really thought things like, when I began, I had these sort of notions like, oh, this is going to be great to write. I mean, when I began in 2009, democracy, American democracy, was popular in the world. We were, in a way, we were a leader. We were leaders of democracy in 2009. We were exporting our product to a world that was eager, in some cases, to by 2016, 17, 18. My entire conception was utterly altered, realizing, I see what Eleanor was fighting against. It really became it activated so many of the issues, fascism and groups like the Southern Democrats in the Senate, entire just insane history of anti-lynching legislation in this country, how we could not form a policy, and so forth, until, in fact, 2 years ago. Was when we finally got a federal anti-lynching bill. No thanks to Rand Paul, and thanks to Kamala Harris. But I just couldn't believe, really, my eyes, as week after week in the later parts of my book, the things that I was writing about, especially our national reckoning with race, that's been happening since 2015, 2014, 2013 even. it began to really take front, first place in people's thoughts and minds every day. And I really felt in a weird sense that it was a gift to be able to see in active real time some of the things that would have been very distant to me. Fascism, for instance, was a very distant topic to me when I began this book. It became something that raged in my heart by the time I was done.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think that your focus on her racial thought and how it changed over time was really an important part of the book. And it both, obviously you were really honest, which was important, both a kind of disturbing aspect of her, but also a hopeful one, because I think what Eleanor demonstrates is that people can change their minds, and they can be, as you said, they can be educated and sort of through their own experiences rethink what they had previously assumed to be true. I have one sort of last kind of question, and then I think if people would like to start putting some questions in the chat, I can field some from the audience. And that has to do with what I think is really a pretty critical part of the biography, which is her personal relationships, often with men. And I was sort of struck by FDR doesn't come off looking very nice in this book. I think at one point you describe him as largely inauthentic. And then in the last section of the book, you spend quite a bit of time talking about her relationship to David Gurevich and her death. And so I guess I'm just kind of wondering why you thought it was really important to delve into those relationships, and also to kind of talk at length about her final year and a half.
Well, it's so awful to be reductive, but look, men disappointed Eleanor Roosevelt, from her father. I try to find, in her life, I try to find who didn't disappoint her. And she didn't go around going, "Oh, I'm so disappointed," and be all mushy about it. No, in fact, quite the opposite. She bore up and decided she would redo things and start over herself. And it was always about adapting to disappointment, that kind of told the story. And also, by the way, it was a kind of, I related to this because when I was a child, I had all this, I guess I must have tested well at some point. I pretty stopped testing well after very quickly, but I sort of must have tested well enough so that people always were saying I wasn't living up to my potential. So I was always put in these remedial classes, or I was always being remediated. And I was always like, and Eleanor was always being remediated. In other words, people always expected of her certain things that then she kind of had to go back to the beginning on. And I felt like with men, there was always this putting her back, trying to put her back in her place, putting her in a place where they would not have to deal with her and not have to deal with, above all, two things that she had in spades, which were intelligence and imagination. And she was really one of the big themes of her column and of her writing is about imaginative life. And she would often, while she was in the middle of an event, or at a rubber chicken dinner on a dais with people, she would think, sort of fantasize about, sort of, what's that person doing? She always had an active life going on in her mind. She didn't do a lot of sharing of this. I don't have some inside track and didn't find some secret diary or something, but it's always there as she talks about her responses to things. And so I felt that men were not only threatened by the things that she was putting out as First Lady, for instance, that had never been seen before. You didn't fly around in airplanes. You didn't get in a car, drive yourself places. You didn't do a lot of things Eleanor Roosevelt did. And women really, really distrusted her. The women at the time were very against a lot of the things she was doing. But what she did was she moved always forward without letting any of the criticism bother her. And she kept teaching herself how to use new technology or how to use new things to bring herself forward. And then whatever followed. What she was constantly doing as she did this and following her own sort of, following her own track, was people were constantly criticizing her for looking a certain way and being a certain way. And the looks were all, what struck me about Eleanor's appearance was that women, more than men, I think, attacked her for being ugly. They were constantly being critical of her appearance, and starting with her mother and moving on through aunts and people all through her life. And she would deprecate, because that was the right thing to do. You didn't make a fuss about yourself. But she was a really good dresser, actually, compared to what people thought. She was beautiful compared to what people thought. And people in meeting her had this reaction all the time, men and women alike. They would just be stunned. And in fact, there's one great little moment right out of a Frank Capra film where she returned to the town in Virginia for a big music festival. And unexpectedly, it was 1933, but unexpected crowds suddenly materialized in the streets of Abington, Virginia, where her father had spent the final days of his life. And so she had a sort of spiritual and sentimental attachment to the town. And so she felt she was in the right place and was so happy to be there. And what she did when she felt that was beam. A radiance came from Eleanor Roosevelt, from her eyes, from her smile, and her skin had a glow. It had a darkish cast to it. In fact, going back 5 generations in the Roosevelt family, you read about this. It's sort of a somewhat, she tanned really beautifully, and there was this glow on her in June of 1933. And from a sudden hush of this crowd in Main Street came a girl's voice saying, she ain't ugly. She's beautiful. The perfect little child's voice suddenly piping up with the truth of the emperor and the clothes and all that. And it was, this woman is beautiful. And that was the thing that I felt important for the reader to see. And I think it's probably why I was a bit preoccupied with appearances. But I also felt very strongly that to understand what men saw in her was very important, to understand the responses she got, and also to understand how she transcended it. And the transcendence is what really, I think, is the theme of the final year of her life, because it's hard to put into quick context, but essentially Eleanor Roosevelt at the age of 77, speaking of the Democratic Party, was running Carmine DeSapio, the last machine boss of Tammany Hall in Greenwich Village, running him out of politics on a rail by being unbelievably shrewd and practical as a politician, even doing things like Carmine DeSapio was running again for, I'm going to say Congress, I think it was a congressional race, I believe. And she would go to the Italian radio station that had more Italian American listeners from Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and down to Philadelphia. And on that program, she would debate DeSapio, and he would only speak D's, Dems, and Do's English, and she would speak Italian. And so she was connecting from her own childhood and from her own language skills. She was always finding ways to be real, more real than the person who was on the platform with her, and that was one of them. But she was, jumping up on a flatbed truck, sick as a dog, to campaign for a young guy named Ed Koch in his reformist race. She was always there for the party. She'd always go out to give one more talk at one more rubber chicken dinner if she could raise money. And in fact, at this point, meaning the last 2 years of her life, she was living in a building that she had bought with her doctor, and now her doctor's wife, Dr. David Gurevich and Edna Gurevich. She and he and Edna and David and Eleanor were all living in the same house. And she had fallen in love with David Gurevich, as they both had gone off to Europe in 1947, he to a sanatorium to recover from tuberculosis, and Eleanor taking care of her doctor, typically, and Eleanor off to the as chair of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, first committee meeting in Geneva, the real beginnings of her post-war and Cold War life in the UN. And she fell in love with this man, and he was 18 years younger and had girlfriends, and he was, at the time he was married, and then was man about town, man about the world with these girlfriends. And she was in absolute thrall to his intelligence, to his sensitivity, to his skill as a doctor. He was a polio pioneer. He was kind of a, she would say to him, I love you more than I've ever loved anyone, and you're my true beloved. And so she really found love. There was a real sense of loving someone and yet was it reciprocal? And in part, yes, but there was not a reciprocal, I think, physical or erotic relationship that could be fully realized or explored. But there was this sort of sense that she belonged and they were close and that they traveled together and so forth. And she could kind of, he was part son, part partner. But it was definitely a complicated relationship. But what finally complicated it most of all was, as things resolved in David's life to remarry a younger woman, Edna Gurvich, and she and David and Eleanor moving in together and sharing a house by floors. And one night, what I was about to say was, she would go out, though sick, she would go to the Waldorf to give one more speech for a Democratic Party fundraiser and come back and say, I raised $100,000 tonight, but tomorrow I've got to go in and get my blood tests. And she was absolutely unflinching about doing her duty always, but she was also treating herself very badly. I mean, she was not taking care of herself. And David Gurvich became the figure of her later life who got her to take this medication and that medication to take care of herself and so forth and so on. But finally, she was diagnosed with anemia, somewhat mysterious blood trouble that resolved into a very, very painful and difficult set of symptoms by the summer of '62, where it became clear to her that she was dying, and she felt that her life was coming to an end, and that she wanted to go with dignity and without excessive hospitalization and all the kinds of things we think of now when we think of end of life rights, and yet with the hero of that struggle living within her in her house when they were joined virtually at the hip, he needed to save her and she didn't want to be saved. And this set up the tension that went on for the last year, where she was hospitalized 4 or 5 times and they never could figure it out until finally they did. It was a drug resistant form of tuberculosis, and a completely difficult set of circumstances, therefore, with wanting to be let go, but no one able to do that. And I felt she was in a way living out the last of trying to do the right thing for other people more even than for herself in the very end.
Thank you so much. We're going to try to squeeze in a few questions as we, no, that's fine, as we get to the bewitching hour. So I want to ask Terry Hall to unmute yourself and ask your question, Terry. Is Terry on?
There.
Hi, Terry.
Oh, hi, Terry.
Eleanor's relationship with Frances Perkins, with the female cabinet member of FDR, if they worked together to persuade him to do some of the wonderful social programs.
Did you get that, David?
About her relationship with Frances Perkins.
Yeah, and to what extent did Eleanor work with Frances Perkins to put together some of the social programs of the New Deal?
Well, I always feel like that's the story that I want. I want there to be more of a story there than there is, I think. And that's because I think Frances Perkins actually, this sounds maybe abrupt, but didn't need Eleanor Roosevelt as much, because in fact, FDR really knew that Frances Perkins was who Frances Perkins was. And I mean, here's the thing. I mean, this puts it somewhat in perspective for me, and I'm not sure if it's correct, but when the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire tragedy occurred, Eleanor was a young Albany-bound politician's wife who was just beginning to figure out how the whole system worked, whereas Frances Perkins was a young reformer who, with Al Smith, and within about 6 years, and by then Eleanor was in Washington as a official's wife, was beginning to create reforms, active reforms. I mean, the bar on the safety bar on every door in a movie theater, factory, or public place that we all know from, you bump up against it at school and that's how you exit at recess. That actual mechanism is on there because of Frances Perkins and Al Smith working together after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. and not so much about Eleanor. And also Frances Perkins's ascension to the cabinet level, the first woman cabinet level, and as labor secretary, was really Frances Perkins. And Eleanor used to say reflexively, I was not the person who got Frances Perkins that position. My husband genuinely knew that that was who he wanted from. Eleanor's influence was much more the kind, at that point, was much more where, for instance, Al Smith's two greatest lieutenants, field generals of his administration who were left in Albany, that is to say, Mrs. Moskowitz and the power broker.
Bob Moses.
Bob Moses, thank you, Robert Moses. FDR realized if he was going to be governor of New York, he had to not have Belle Moskowitz and Robert Moses on his team. He had to create his own team. And it was Eleanor who actually persuaded him and said, you're not going to get anything done if Belle Moskowitz stays there. So that was the kind of thing she was very, very involved in that. And I should know, I think, off the top of my head, I should know more about Frances Perkins and Eleanor, except I only know that they really deeply admired each other. And that in fact, it's Frances Perkins who, for instance, when she visited at Albany, it was Frances Perkins who shared a room one night with Eleanor. Eleanor, in every house she lived in, the Roosevelts lived, had so many children and people, and that sometimes, Eleanor would end up for a month at a time in that room, in that single bed. And at a given time that Frances Perkins remembers, they spent literally an entire night, like two girls in school or something, telling each other stories of their life. And Eleanor was incredibly candid and trusted Frances Perkins to understand about her father and her mother and all the different things that had happened to her to that point. And it was Frances Perkins who actually, I think, helped Eleanor Roosevelt biographers like me and from the beginning to really understand who she was as a person, because Frances Perkins saw her, really, really got her, and was able to translate that.
Thanks. Julie Rowan, do you want to ask your question real quick?
Yes, thank you. What would you say was Eleanor's greatest personal disappointment, and also maybe her greatest professional disappointment, something she felt that she was not able to accomplish?
I think her greatest professional disappointment was that so many of the things she began had to be left unresolved. Arthur Dale, the experimental homestead community in West Virginia during the early part of the New Deal that she developed with Nancy Cook and with Harry Hopkins, and both the flaws that occurred in the building of it and the realization of it, which she herself was contributing to personally, and spending a great deal of time on. I think that it felt to me emotionally sort of like the way maybe healthcare was with Hillary Clinton, when she was sort of an early project that had high hopes on it that was not as fully realized as she hoped it would be. I think she suffered a bit from that. I think she suffered also a bit from her hopes at opening. I mean, an example, a minor, maybe not minor, but a small example would be the way she opened the White House to a group of young African-American women who were living in a school that was extremely run down in Washington, D.C., who were horribly criticized and demeaned by the national press and by Republicans when they appeared at the White House under Eleanor Roosevelt's invitation. They were criticized for the dresses they were wearing, for everything they were criticized. And she felt terrible at exposing them to this kind of storm, but then also all her hopes for reforming and making the school itself where they lived at the time better all fell apart very soon after. So things like that came, and there were these attempts, and then they were left. And I think she always felt that those were disappointments. Personally, I think she was hardest on herself and felt the most disappointment at being a mother. And in that sense, it was because I think she paradoxically did exactly the right thing as a parent to say to each of her children, when they were grown, I can't be responsible for your life. You have to make your choices. I can help you, I can advise you, but ultimately it is your life, and I'm not going to I'm not going to step in more here than I should. And I think she really took stands that made her kids feel that she could be loving to the world, but not to them. She also suffered a great deal on their behalf because they had a really tough row, I think, row to hoe in a certain way, as the president's children. On the other hand, they also, grandchildren she really did have a relationship with, and she had an unusually good relationship with her daughters-in-law, whom she really became very close to and doted upon. But her sons were a disappointment because although she admired, for instance, their war service, she admired the things that they could and did do politically. She also always felt that they were being taken advantage of and that they should be wiser about this. And so I think it was hard for her to see her children make mistakes in real time and not be able to do anything about it, even though she was wise about it. And I think it was also, she played favorites. She had one son, Elliot, was a favorite, who was the one who was most like her father. And I think in a way she repeated some of the relationship from father to her son, in some ways around alcohol and other issues. But I think she was always hardest on herself. I mean, she's her worst critic. I don't think she's her worst enemy at all, but I think she was absolutely her worst critic. And it's nice to see her lighten up later in her life on herself. I mean, she definitely knew that some of the things she had done were wonderful. But
that's great. I think we have time for one more question. So if Carol LeMay wants to ask the final question, that would be great. Are you still on, Carol?
I am. Yeah, you were mentioning earlier about Eleanor's physical appearance, and I thought, I was wondering if Eleanor's mother, who I understand was considered a real beauty of her time, did she try to protect her daughter from being judged primarily by her physical appearance? Did her mother play any role in emphasizing developing her mind and character rather than just her physical appearance and beauty?
No, I mean, the thing is that I think her mother compounded
These
sort of beauty canon expectations of the day by tacitly requiring Eleanor to be a very beautiful reflection of herself. And that's where the sort of narcissistic wound takes place, is that she's always in a sense saying, well, she was saying literally to Eleanor, you are such a disappointment to me. I mean, when Eleanor was shy, and when Eleanor was socially shy, her mother was pained by this and would almost take the kind of mom who would say, oh dear, you don't have to be shy, in front of all the kids. I mean, that's the worst thing for a shy person. And that's just what she did. Or she'd say literally, oh Granny, don't look so stern. I mean, literally mocking her. That's as the record shows, that was her tack with her daughter, who she tried. But there was also, as a parent, when Eleanor did things that are totally understandable, normal and so forth, she was quite mean to her about those things, with doing poorly in school or stammering or forgetting her place. And when she was reciting something, although she had a wonderful memory, her mother would throw her off, even of her skills and of her talents, by making her think she should do better. It was always a world where good was not good enough. And the beauty part of it is just painful, because her mother was part of a corrupt system and was called the second most beautiful in New York. Guess why? She actually was probably the most beautiful, but Mrs. Astor had to be called the first most beautiful in New York. So that's the thing. It's always this sort of, and her mother wanted to be a social leader and was turning outward in a way for the first time into a world of the press and of social columns and things that was just getting started. And so this is not the Eleanor Roosevelt, this is not her context. And the thing that she really suffered from was that when she was then forced into taking an active part in that world, coming out as a debutante in 1901, she was forced to face the peers of her mother, the peers of her father, both of them dead, both her parents dead, and her father having been utterly disgraced and shamed by a death from alcohol and drug addiction that had screamed in headlines across the newspapers saying, demented Elliot Roosevelt dies of drink in a rage, they with a mistress, and the scandal that he brought himself down with resonated in those places where Eleanor now had to show herself as a young woman, presenting herself, and know that every man in the room had remembered her father's, awful final days, or how sad it was that he had succumbed to that. She just was carrying way too much luggage.
Yeah. It's amazing what she accomplished as a woman, given that background. I mean, that narcissistic mother, I was looking for, surely there's something positive in there. Maybe she was trying to protect her, because that is such an awful life and so painful. I was looking for that, but I guess it's not there. So, more credit to Eleanor for overcoming all that and accomplishing everything that she did. She's an amazing woman.
Yeah, no, the transcendence of even the transcendence not only of personal, but of class itself, and transcending the demands of the, and we were talking earlier, Margaret and I, about especially transcending that class's idea of itself as superior, as being superior beings, which ended up, as in eugenics and all the horror history of the 20th century comes out of a class of people thinking that they're superior to another class of people. And I think people who were taught that had a hard time, the way people who get money and power, they have a hard time learning out of it. Eleanor did learn out of it, and she opened up to a new potential for pluralistic democracy, sharing a multicultural democracy with other people.
That's just such a fitting way, I think, to close out our talk, just to sort of remember the long-term consequences and reverberations of Eleanor's vision for the world. And thanks for reminding us too about her. She is a teacher and an educator, and I think those of us who are affiliated with the university, that's where we carry her in our hearts and in our mission. So thank you so much, David, for bringing Eleanor to life today, resurrecting her for an hour and 10 minutes. And thank you everyone for staying on for a few extra moments as we wrapped up. We really appreciate it. So thanks again.
Thanks so much.